The positivity of a narcissist is an act. They're very negative people, very pessimistic, very jealous, because they live in a world where nothing is ever good enough. They're never good enough. They would need to be perfect in order to maintain this experience of being good enough, and they can't. They can't be perfect, and they hate to see anybody else doing well. See, that's what envy is. Envy and jealousy is essentially the projection of responsibility for one's own feelings of inadequacy. Just observing somebody happy, just observing somebody successful is enough to trigger a narcissistic injury. And that is really just essentially the fear response to one's own emotional changes. And so you see, it's not just that they have chaotic emotions, they have the same subconscious triggers as everyone else. But you see, they have an extraordinary level of fear of their own experience being revealed as less than perfect. And so the internal emotions that they feel, they fault them. The observation of their own emotions being less than perfect makes them feel not good enough, makes them constantly compare themselves, even emotionally, to other people. And the black and white thinking means that they cannot really empathize with people because they're always in fight or flight, always. A narcissist is always in fight or flight. They're stuck in rumination. And so the principal mechanism of their mind is analyzing everything. Everything's a calculation, and every move they make is literally an approximation of necessity. And everything they're doing is of avoidance. And so you see, they're avoiding their own emotions. And to avoid their own emotions, they need to fix and change their emotions. They need to deny their emotions. They need to attack anything that alters the way they feel about themselves. And so they're constantly in a defensive or predatory posture because they're always in fight or flight. And so this is a person whose mind is entirely collapsed. And when I say entirely collapsed, what I mean is that they've lost significant aspects of what it would be to be a human being because they're just stuck in fear. They're just stuck in a loop of fight or flight. And so what they consider themselves to be is only an ego. There is nothing else for them as far as what they know or experience. They're cut off, and so they're neurologically cut off. And so you see, when you talk about the higher self, you're talking about higher levels of cognitive function. You're talking about intuition, and you're talking about objective observation. You see, people stuck in ego do not have objective awareness. What they have is they have a subjective experience that is given by whatever emotional dynamic is active in their subconscious. And so this pervasive experience of being inadequate, this not good enough, dominates them every moment. They're in it all the time. They're also stuck in shame. You see, with some of the things that you observe in their behaviors, the reason why narcissists can be so shameful and they don't experience it quite that way is because the shame is stuck on all the time. And since they're always in this negative state, there's no emotional penalties to additional shameful acts. And so there's no boundaries. You see, they're not going to feel an increase of shame if they're always in it. And so you have to start to understand that when a mind is always stimulated in a particular way, it loses awareness of that because that shame becomes the backdrop of their entire experience of existence. It's always there. So it's just part of the ether of their existence. And so like if you think about wearing a wristwatch, if you were to change the wristwatch to the other arm, you would notice it again. You see, some of these stuck emotions in the narcissist are always there. And so they don't experience a shift or change when acting upon certain behaviors. And so they're trying to escape feeling bad, and that will drive them to do quite devious or shameful things. You see, their experience of sadism is simply the release from resentment. And you see, it's perceived as a good sensation. Because if you're starting here and you're going there, there can be a release or almost a euphoria, but that's really because it's likely neurologically they're hypersensitive to dopamine, because being in a chronically depressed state is going to cause a sensitization of those pathways. You see, when you think about addiction, you know that there's a downregulation for the receptors for whatever, neurotransmitters being oversaturated. So if you have elevated dopamine levels, the correction is a reduction in receptors to normalize that physiological circumstance in the synapse. Well, if you think about somebody that's chronically in a state of stress, anxiety, negative thoughts, and depression, it's being maintained a low serotonin, low dopamine level. Well, there's going to be a sensitization of dopamine, an upregulation for receptors. And so that's why we see sadism and psychopathy, is that somebody that is always in a bad feeling has an artificial sense of reward for doing things that hurt other people, because it helps release them. And so you see the ego are a series of maladaptive, stuck, fight or flight based emotional capturings that are neurologically being reproduced in the mind of a person, keeping them in a collapse of rumination. And the escape from this insidious experience is what people, seek validation for. And so you see people trying to escape their own emotions develop behavioral patterns, that become lifelong afflictions that you define as mental illnesses. But the real mental illness is the ego itself. And so the escape from feeling not good enough looks like external validation. Whether it's success, whether it's accumulation of things like material possessions, or accomplishments, or whatever it may be, people are trying to become good enough, right? And so the constant need to prove one's good enough has people running on treadmills their whole life. Well, if somebody is stuck in resentment, then it will look like sadistic acts. And so whatever behaviors people are engaging in are going to be correlated to the stuck emotions within their subconscious that give rise to the experiential necessity to go from this discomfort to this comfortable feeling. And so the grass is always greener. And so whatever people are ruminating about, children discovered fantasy as a way of using their imagination to invent potential futures in which they would alleviate these emotional dynamics. And you call that goals. And so whether somebody's ruminating on engaging in some kind of sadistic act, or somebody's ruminating about some people-pleasing endeavor, or somebody's thinking about their goals, the fantasy world of the ego is always a future in which there's a carrot they're chasing, which is fixing how they feel. And so when somebody's emotions are stuck, this absolutely collapses their mind within the world of that emotion, and the ruminations and thoughts that a person have are going to be automatically given by whatever emotional states they happen to be stuck in. That's why when people feel rejected, abandoned, failure, they get triggered into a state of failure yesterday, and then they end up ruminating, causing them to recontextualize everything that they remember about themselves. And then this projected experience then becomes the basis of how they navigate in a pattern of avoiding failure. And so these are unnatural emotions that are actually neurological positive feedback loops, where the observation of these emotions by the individual triggers the same emotion, because this is the fight or flight having attacked and objectified the person. And so all these different mental illnesses just represent different differentiated egos, and the underlying emotions that cause it are all the same. It's just that the personality of a person is absolutely a pathology, that all personalities are pathologies. People don't know that. But fixed, rigid ways of being and acting are essentially mandated in the first-person experience by the altered reality that the subconscious emotions that are stuck on since childhood is creating. And so the world according to a person is hell as an ego, an inescapable world where the same emotions repeat, the same distortions in reality, necessitating the same behavioral patterns that project onto other people and society arbitrarily. It invented the hierarchy. The hierarchy is simply the psychological product of the ego, an inescapable emotional dynamic that depends on external validation for people to form a comfort zone between the two poles of the ego, which should be trying to figure out how to be perfect in the future, or figuring out that they can't, and confabulating stories to obscure the shame accumulated by being stuck and paralyzed within this dynamic itself. And so people saying I can't are just in the flight portion of the ego. So the ego is a fight or flight mechanism that gave rise to the personality and invented the subconscious mind as a dissociation from the total sum of one's cognitive power. And so that's what we're dealing with here. My coffee's kicking in. I'll see you on the live stream.